Azriel and Iris Miller in the schus of the Holy Soldiers of the IDF and the merit of our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael. We thank all of our Talmud Torah sponsors for their incredible generosity. And Rabbi, with that, let us begin. Okay, not sure what's not working. Okay. All right, we'll say good morning. So today's daf is Ayin Zayin, 77. And we are picking up in Meretz Hashem at the Mishnah, top of Ayin Zayin. So we'll say we are completing actually today, tomorrow, really tomorrow. Today and tomorrow, Meretz Hashem will round out the sugya of yichus, of ultimately genealogy. So the Mishnah says as follows: Bas chalal zachar psula minakuna. The daughter of a male zachar. Sorry, daughter of a male zachar. Got it. Right, the daughter of a male chalal. So we'll say, so remember again, we have just a typical case, not so well, it's typical for us now as holding in the sugya, not so typical. Kohen marries a grusha, they have a son, let's call that son Ruvain. So Ruvain is a chalal. So what's the halacha? The daughter of a chalal is pasul for kahuna. So in other words, the chalalos is passed down through the father. And the Mishnah says the olam, that is there forever. Yisrael shenasa chalala bito ksher lekahuna. On the other hand, if a Yisrael marries a chalala, their daughter is ksher lekahuna. So we'll say, so this is a very important distinction. Chalalos is passed down through the father, not through the mother. So if halacha l'maisa the father is a chalal, then ultimately again his daughter, his son is certainly a chalal as well, but his daughter is prohibited to marry to the kahuna. On the other hand, if halacha l'maisa a Yisrael marries a chalala, their daughter is totally fit to marry into the kahuna. Chalal shenasa bas Yisrael bita psula. So if a chalal goes ahead and marries a bas Yisrael, their daughter is unfit for the kahuna. Rabbi Yehuda omer bas ger zachar kebas chalal zachar. Rabbi Yehuda says the daughter, right, the daughter of a male ger is just like the daughter of a male chalal, meaning the same way that the daughter of a chalal can't marry into the kahuna, so the daughter of a ger can't marry into the kahuna as well. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says Yisrael shenasa giores bito kshera. Rabbi Eliezer says that if a Yisrael marries a giores, their daughter is permitted into the kahuna, ksher lekahuna. The ger shenasa bas Yisrael, ksher lekahuna. So we'll say it's interesting. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov holds like this. So we'll say here's what we have. So by chalal is passed down by the father. So if the father is a chalal, then ultimately the daughter is not permitted to marry into the kahuna. Mother is a chalala and she marries a Yisrael, daughter is totally fine. Rabbi Yehuda essentially equates a ger with a chalal. With a chalal. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says something very interesting. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, when it comes to gerim, as long as one of the parents is a natural born Jew, then ultimately again the offspring is permitted to marry into the kahuna. The ger shenasa bas Yisrael b'to ksher lekahuna. Aval, we'll say first wide line Ayin Zayin 77a. Aval, ger shenasa giores, but if a ger married a giores, meaning in this case both parents are gerim, then bito psula lekahuna. Ultimately, again, then the daughter is not permitted to marry into the kahuna. Echad ger ve'echad avadim mishuchrarim. This is true with the ger. This is true with an evad mishuchrar. Afilu ad yud doros. Even until 10 generations. I will say we spoke about the 10 generation concept in Friday's daf, where we spoke about this concept that a family could have the identity of gerim until the identity of gerus is lost. At what point is or forgotten? At what point is the identity of gerus lost? So again, the Gemara posited up until 10 generations. Imo mi Yisrael, until the mother is from the Jewish people. In other words, a natural born Jew. Now, will say what this means is until either the mother or the father is a natural born Jew. So I will say, just to consolidate this, the position of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is that when it comes to gerim, as long as one of the parents is a natural born Jew, the child is fit for the kahuna. The only challenge you'll run into is if both parents are gerim, then ultimately again the child is not permitted to marry into the kahuna. That's the halacha. Or that's Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Rabbi Yossi says, "Af ger shenasa giores bito ksher lekahuna." And ultimately, Rabbi Yossi says, even if both parents are gerim, the offspring is permitted to the kahuna. So I will say, so this is the major machlokes over here we have. So remember again, just to focus for a bit. Tanakama, first opinion, the Mishnah tells me that chalalos is passed down through the father. So if the father is a chalal, then the daughter will not be permitted to marry into the kahuna. If the mother is a chalala, doesn't get transmitted. That's halacha number one. Now we'll say part two of the Mishnah was what about gerim? So Rabbi Yehuda said that essentially ger has the same din as a halal. Same din as a halal. So therefore, again, if the father is a ger, then ultimately the daughter can't marry into the kahuna. If the mother is a ger, the daughter can marry into the kuna. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov saying, as long as one of the parents was born Jewish, the offspring is totally fine for the kuna. And then the extreme position, or his lenient extreme position, Rabbi Yossi says, even if both parents are gerim, the offspring is permitted to marry into the kuna. That's our machlokes. Let's go. Says the Gemara, Maili Olam. Now we'll say, we're focusing now on the first line. The Mishnah said, Bas Chalal Zachar, Psula min hakuna li Olam. The daughter of a male Chalal is prohibited to marry into the kahuna forever. The Gemara says, what does that mean forever? What would you have thought? Midi dahava amitzri ve'adomi. I would have thought maybe chalalos is like a mitzri or an adomi. Rabbi say, what's the halacha about mitzri and adomi? Ma lahalon la'achar shalosh daros, afkan nami la'achar shalosh daros. Kamash will know. Rabbi say mitzri and adomi, we know they're allowed to convert, but they are prohibited from marrying into the general marriage pool for 3 generations. So I would have thought that perhaps maybe a halal should have the same halacha. Kamash Malon know that a halal ultimately is a genealogical blemish that continues to be passed on generation to generation without pause. Good. Says the Gemara, sorry. Yisrael shenasa halala. So remember again, the next part of the Mishnah was if Yisrael married a halala. So remember again, in that case, the offspring is kosher. Offspring is kosher. Says the Gemara, Minahanimili. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. So clearly what comes out over here is chalalos is a genealogical condition passed down through the father, not passed down through the mother. So the Gemara says, from where do we know that? Minahanimili. Ne'emar kan v'lo yichalel zaro ba'amov. So it says over here, ultimately, again, his never say we're going to see. This is actually interesting. This phrase "lo yichalel zaro ba'amav" means literally his seed should not be profaned in his people. We're going to interpret that phrase a little bit differently in different contexts. Lo yitama ba'al ba'amav lahalon. Sorry, lo yitama ba'al ba'amav. The pasuk is talking about over here that if a Kohen is married to someone who he is not permitted to be married to, he is not permitted to become tamei first. So let's say a Kohen marries a grusha and then his wife dies, he's not permitted to go to that levaya. So the Gemara says, Ma lahalon zechar v'lo nekevos. Just like by the case of by the Tumah by Kohanim, it's talking about men and not by women. Afkan, so to by chalalos, zecharim velo nekevos. Chalalos is only a din ultimately in men, not in women. And therefore, again, it is only the chalal who passes down that genealogical reality to his daughter, and a chalala does not. So the Gemara says, Elamiata, if that's the case, Bitel shall Kohen Gadol tishteri, then ultimately, again, the Gemara says, the daughter of a Kohen Gadol should be permitted. Now, which daughter of a Kohen Gadol? Rashi says over here, Mina Amana. Let's say a Kohen Gadol illegally marries a widow. Illegally marries a widow. So what's talacha? Perhaps again, she should be, this girl, this daughter, should be permitted to go ahead and marry into the kahuna. After all, miksiv, so the Gemara says, again, if you're telling me that the restrictions or the impact or the halachos, the strictures of kahuna really only apply to the men, don't apply to the women. So why shouldn't the daughter of a Kohen Gadol be permitted, even if her mother was a grusha? To which the Gemara says, Miksiv bino, does it say his son? Zaro ksiv. Lo yichalel zaro ba'amov. So Rabbi said the Torah speaks out the concept of lo yichalel zaro, his offspring. So you see over here that as much as chalalos is only passed down through the father, not the mother, other genealogical issues apply to the offspring of a Kohen. If that's the case, bas b'no tishteri, so ultimately the daughter of a son should be permitted. Ksiv Gemara says, Ksiv lo yichalel zaro. Pasuk says he shall not profane his offspring, his seed. Makish zaro lo. Mahu bito psula. Just like if the Kohen marries someone he's not allowed to, ultimately his daughter is unfit for the kahuna. Af b'no bito psula kuna. So too again, if there's a genealogical blemish like a chalalos that's created, that's passed down through the son's daughter is also not permitted to marry into the kahuna. I bas Bas bito tisar, so let the daughter of his daughter become asura as well. Im kein gzera shava maya hanile. If that's the case, what good did the gzera shava do? So this is nukuda number one. And I will say, this is, we'll try to do the halacha l'maisa as we go through the sugya. This is the halacha. The halacha is that chalalos is passed down through the father, not through the mother. So if a chalal marries a Yisraelis, which is, by the way, a chalal can marry whoever he wants. A male chalal can marry whoever he wants, even a kohenes. Just the difference is whoever he marries, that offspring has chalalos as well. Now remember, who is that going to impact? It really is only going to impact a daughter, because a daughter then can't go ahead and marry a Kohen. But if you have a woman who is a chalala, so for example, a Kohen marries a grusha, and they have a daughter, she's a chalala, and she marries someone, that offspring does not have chalalos. So chalalos only pass down through the father, not passed down through the mother. But again, I will say, if you have ben achar, son after son after son from chalalos, just understand there's no limitation. In other words, that genealogical issue keeps getting passed down generation after generation. Okay, so let's go weiter. Chalal shenasa bas Yisrael bita psula. So remember again, if a chalal married a bas Yisrael, so remember again, you have a boy who's a chalal. Again, let's say his father was a Kohen, his mother was a Grusha, and therefore, again, he is a Chalal. Now he marries a regular Jewish girl, totally permitted. They have a daughter. That daughter is a Chalala, right, and can't marry into the Kahuna. We already learned this in the beginning of the Mishnah. Bas Chalal Zachar Psul Min HaKahuna. We already learned this. It's redundant. You already told me the opening line in the Mishnah is that the daughter of a male Chalal ultimately is not permitted to marry into the kuna. So why the need to restate it? To which the Gemara says, you're right. The olam aidi ditana reisha yisrael shenasa chalala. Since the reisha opened up with the case of Yisrael that married a chalala, tana nami seifa chalal shenasa bas Yisrael. So Mishnaic symmetry. It is redundant, but just to preserve Mishnaic symmetry, the Mishnah stated the case again. Masnisin delau Rabbi Dostai. So the Gemara says our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Dostai. What did Rabbi Dostai say? The sign Rabbi Dostai ben Yehuda Omer, Kishim Shebnei Yisrael mikva tara lechalalos, kach benos Yisrael mikva tara lechalalim. So Rabbi said this is interesting. But Dostai says the same way that Bnei Yisrael are a mikva tara lechalalos. In other words, Rabbi say, if halacha l'maisa, you have a girl who is a chalala, right? So again, remember, Kohen marries a grusha, they illegal. But it works. They have a daughter. That daughter is now a chalala. That daughter marries a regular Jewish guy. What's the status of their offspring? Totally fine. So Rabbi Dostai says like this: the same way that a regular Jewish guy, so to speak, is a mikvah, right? He's a mikvah for a chalala. Kach benos Yisrael mikvah tara lechalalim. So ultimately, again, benos Yisrael. So too, again, a regular Jewish woman will also be, so to speak, a mikvah for a chalal. So Rabbi Dostai says, I will say, this works both ways. Essentially, Rabbi Dostai says, as long as the chalala spouse, or chalal spouse, whether it's the man or the woman, marries a regular Yisrael or Yisraelis, the resulting offspring is fine. So our Mishnah clearly doesn't reflect that view, right? Because our Mishnah says the only way it works is if a chalala marries a Yisrael, then their offspring is fine. But if a chalal marries a Yisraelis, then ultimately the chalalis is passed down. So our Mishnah doesn't reflect the view of Rabbi Dostai. My time is Rabbi Dostai. Rabbi Huda, why does Rabbi Dostai hold that as long as one of the spouses is Yisrael, then the offspring is totally fine? Amakra lo yechalel zaro ba'amav. This is interesting. Ba'am echad hu demechol b'shnei amamin eino mechol. So we'll say this is fascinating. Rabbi Dostai's logic is like this: the only time that chalalis gets passed on, Rabbi Dostai posits, is when both parents are chalalim. Fascinating. If both parents are chalalim, then the offspring becomes a chalal. But ultimately, again, if only one parent is a chalal, then by definition, the other genealogically pure parent ultimately takes care of the offspring, and no chalalos is passed down. So I will say, again, we don't hold like Rabbi Dostai, but a fascinating shita just to keep in mind. Incredible. We'll say, I'll just point out also the lashon over here of Rabbi Dostai is such a beautiful lashon. Shebnei Yisrael, Kishem Shebnei Yisrael mikva taira lechalalos. Right, the lashon that Klal Yisrael itself is a mikva tara. Right, the Gemara Rabbi Dostai compares the Jewish people to a mikvah. So Rabbi said there's a beautiful, beautiful insight in the Gemara Maseches Yoma discussing the power of tshuva. Says ma mikvah metares atmeim kach HaKadosh Baruch Hu metaher as achod. The same way that the mikvah purifies those who sin, so too the Ribono Shel Olam is able to purify those who go ahead and sin. I'm sorry. Just like the mikvah purifies those who are tamei, who are ritually impure, so too HaKadosh Baruch Hu has the ability to go ahead and purify those who sin. And the Mishnah quotes the pasuk, Mikveh Yisrael Hashem, that the Ribono Shel Olam is the mikvah of Klal Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the mikvah of Klal Yisrael. So Rabbi Silber said, you see two things over here. There are three things that are called the mikvah in this world. A mikvah is a mikvah, right? Number two, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a mikvah. And number three, Klal Yisrael is a mikvah. Klal Yisrael is a mikvah. Mikveh Yisrael Hashem. Hashem is a mikvah, Klal Yisrael is a mikvah. So the Rishner said something so beautiful. The Rishner said, you know how it works with a mikvah, right? In order for the mikvah to work, what has to happen? A person has to fully immerse themselves in it. Right? If you just dip your toe in the mikvah, it's not the pshat that the tara spreads throughout your body. In order for a mikvah to work, you have to be fully immersed. So the Rabbi Shmuel Silber, the Hilgah said, it's the same thing with using HaKadosh Baruch Hu as a mikvah and using Klal Yisrael as a mikvah. If you want the Ribono Shel Olam to be your mikvah, you have to be all in. You have to be all in. Throw yourself into HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, all in doesn't mean I'm perfect. And all in doesn't mean that I'm always doing what I'm supposed to do. But all in means I'm in. Ribono Shel Olam, I'm in. I will say, if you want Klal Yisrael to be your mikvah, then what does that mean? You have to be all in. You have to be all into Achdus. You have to be all into your people. You have to be committed to the Am, the good parts of the Am, the not so good parts of the Am. You have to be fully immersed in Klal Yisrael. In fact, he used to say about the Rishner that on Simchas Torah, when the Hasidim were dancing, and they formed a circle around him, they would see the Rishner going like this, going up and down, up and down, up and down. They said, Rebbe, what are you doing? He said, I am immersing in the mikvah of Klal Yisrael. I'm immersing in the mikvah of Klal Yisrael. They'll say, the mikvah only works if you're all in. If you're all into the water, if you're all into HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if you're all in for Klal Yisrael, then again you get to be zocheh to that triple immersion. The immersion of a regular mikvah, the immersion of the Ribono Shel Olam, the immersion of Klal Yisrael, but it requires my full commitment to my God and my full commitment to my people. Incredible. Says the Gemara, Tan Rabbanan, Lo yichalel zaro. Pasuk says, don't profane your offspring. Ainli elazaro. So I only know that the offspring of a forbidden union ultimately again becomes chalolim. He atzma minayin. Now remember again, there's another piece to this. A Kohen has a child with a grusha. A Kohen marries a grusha, has a child. So actually let's use almana. Let's use almana for Kohen Gadol. It's a good example, right? Almana for Kohen Gadol. So remember again, a Kohen Gadol marries an almana, illegal. So their offspring is going to be a halal, but the woman herself, the almana herself is now a halala. So let's say the Kohen Gadol dies, so technically speaking, an almana is normally allowed to go ahead and marry a regular Kohen. This woman cannot, because she herself has become psula as a result of the forbidden union. Where do we know that from? So the Gemara says, Amit kal v'chomer, it's kal v'chomer, ma zaro shelo avra avera mischalel. So the offspring, which didn't do anything wrong, yet it becomes a chalal. He asked Moshe avra avera and didn't mischalelas. Ultimately, she did commit navera. So because she did commit navera, certainly she's going to become a chalala. To which the Gemara says, well, who atzma yochiach? The Kohen himself will prove that this is wrong. Sha'avra avera. Rabbi say, the Kohen himself. Let's say the Kohen Gadol goes in and marries the almana. So he himself did the avera. Ve'ein mischala. Yet Rabbi say he doesn't become a chalal. Now, interestingly enough, when a Kohen is in the midst or is committed to an illegal marriage, so the halacha is he's not allowed to do the avoda while he's married, but he does not become permanently disqualified. In other words, should he divorce this woman or should she pass away, halacha l'maaseh he's permitted to resume avoda. To which the Gemara says, "Maluhu shekein ein mischal b'chol makom." That's different because ultimately, again, the Kohen Gadol himself, or any Kohen, doesn't have the ability to be transformed into a halal. Tomar b'hisha mischaleles b'chol makom, but a woman herself can become a chalala. V'im nafshecha lomar, and if you want to say, Amakra lo yichalel zaro. Pasuk says he shall not profane his seed. Lo yichulal zeh shahaya kasher v'nischalal. So the Gemara says it means that ultimately, again, who could become mechulal? He or she who was kasher and then became a chalal. Mayim nafsh chalom. What does it mean the nafsh chalomar? Perhaps you could say, you could ask Kapircha, the offspring itself, maybe it's different. Maybe the offspring is different. Since the offspring itself, the entire creation of the offspring was a ma'aseh avera. Amakra lo yichalel. Lo yichulal zeh shahaya kasher v'nischalal. So Rabbi say this drasha teaches us that the woman herself becomes a chalala as a result of the illegal relationship with a kohen. So lo yichulal means she who was kasher can now become profane. Tan Rabbanan, Eizo hi chalala. Rabbi say, what is a chalala? Kol shenolda min psulim. Anyone who is born ultimately again from psulim. Mar says, my psulim. What do you mean psulim? Ilema psulim lo. If you're talking about any woman who is puzzled to the man herself, hari machzir grushasa. What about the following case? So imagine the following situation. Reuben is married to Rachel. What happens? They get divorced. Rachel married. Now, we'll say, is a couple permitted to get remarried after they get divorced? Absolutely. But now what happens? Unless he's a Kohen. Right? Now what happens? So now Rachel goes ahead and marries Shimon. Rachel marries Shimon. So what's the halacha? The halacha is now, at that point, if they get divorced, so then halacha l'maisa, Reuven can't remarry Rachel. They can't remarry. So let's say Reuven does remarry her. So what's the halacha? Hay machzir grushaso de psula lo. Oh, I'm sorry. The psula lo, ultimately again, where she is puzzled to him, ubanek sherim, and ultimately again, in that case, halacha l'maisa, the offspring is still kosher. And this is interesting. So this is a case of an illegal marriage, right? Reuven remarries his divorcee after she was married and divorced from someone else. That's an illegal marriage. That ultimately, again, she's puzzled to him, but halacha l'maisa, the offspring are kosher. So you see, not every illegal marriage creates chalalim. Dichsiv toivahi, right? Toivahi, he toiva ve'in banei tovim. The relationship is a toiva, but the offspring are not. Amar Rav Yehuda Halikam, what it means to say. Ezuhi chalala. What is the case of a chalala? Kol shenolda min psul kahuna. Any offspring that was born as a result of an illegal marriage. So both say, any time you have illegality in a marriage to a Kohen, that produces chalalos. The Gemara says, nol de in, lo nol de lo. It's only if, now both say, now here's what's interesting. So apparently the only time that chalalos takes place is when there was offspring. If there was no offspring, no chalalos. I hari amana ugrusha zona delo nol de v'kahavi chalala. They both say, what about all the cases? Ultimately, again, if a Kohen or a Kohen Gadol marries someone who is illegal, right, that woman becomes a chalala herself. Even though, again, there's no offspring. Amarava, this is what it means to say, Hali Kamar, Ezo chalala muskeres, shalo hayala shasa kosher klal. What's the case of chalala rabosai that the Torah makes reference to, of a person who was never genealogically fit, kol shenolda min pasal kahuna, or psula kahuna. This refers to someone who was born, ultimately, again, from a union of psula kahuna. Fine. My muskeres. So what does it mean? What is lashon muskeres was mentioned? Amar Yisrael baravin hachikamar. Ezo hi chalala sheikar me divrei Torah ve'in suichel nefarish divrei sofrim. We'll say, what is the paradigmatic case of biblical chalala that is mentioned in Torah and does not need any rabbinic explanations? Kol shenolda min psulei kahuna. All right, so we'll say it's interesting. After all of this discussion regarding chalalos, what's now happening is the Gemara giving us a definition, right? What is the definition of chalal or chalala? The biblical definition of chalala is any time a child is born of a union prohibited to the Kohen, ultimately, again, that offspring is a chalal. That's it, or chalala. Fine. Tanrabanan. Amana. So let's say the Gemara says Amana. Amana. Actually, before we go on to this, we'll say. So therefore, just to be clear on what we have. So halacha l'maisa. Remember, as I mentioned before. So we are going with the idea. that halacha l'maisa. Let me read it to you. that chalal shenosek. So remember, if you have two chalalim, just to clarify, if you have two chalalim marrying each other, then obviously their offspring are going to be chalalim, right? And remember, the chalalos genealogical blemish passes down generation after generation, right? Sahalocha l'maisa. This is true also. Furthermore, again, if you have a chalal who married a Yisraelis, ultimately, again, chalalos is passed down through the father. But if you have a Yisrael who marries a chalala, that chalalos is not passed down. It's not passed down. Good. So the Gemara goes right there. Fine, that's it. We're just restating the halacha as we knew it. It's a Tanarabana. We'll say interesting case here. Almana, eno chayiv ela achas. So we'll say, if a Kohen, now it's not immediately clear what this case is, but literally what it sounds like saying, Kohen Gadol has relations with an almana, and an almana. Okay. Eno chayiv ela achas. He's only chayiv once. I will have to see the case. Grusha. He has relations with a grusha, busy day. Eno chayiv ela achas. Right? Ultimately, again, he's only chayiv once. All right, so we'll say, so let's see what this means. Amana grusha v'chalala, zona. Okay? He has relations with an amana, a grusha, a chalala, and a zona. Bizman shem kiseder, if it follows that order, chayiv al kol achas v'achas. Then it'll be chayiv for every single one. Right? Zinsa, v'nis chalala, v'nis garsha, v'nis armala, eno chayev ela achas. So I will say, so here's what's interesting. That last case of amana, grusha, chalala, zona, the Gemara seems to indicating is talking about one woman who has all of these identities. So if she has the identities in that order, she acquires the identities in that order, and he has relations with her, then ultimately, again, he's going to be chayav for each and every infraction. If, however, again, zinsa, v'nischala, v'niskarsha, v'nisarmala, but I will say, if halacha l'maisa, she acquired the identities in a different order, enu chayav ela achas. She's only chayav once. Okay, so let's analyze this. Amar bar. So we'll say, let's go through the first case. Almana, enu chayav ela achas. So then says, what are we talking about over here? Ilema sheba al almanas Ruvain va al almanas Shimon va al almanas Levi. So if we're talking about where the Kohen Gadol literally had relations with three different women, right? Three almanas, three distinct almanas. Amai eno chayiv ela achas. So we'll say, why would he be chayiv only once? Amud beis hare gufen mechulakim. We'll say these are three different women. And if they're three different women, then ultimately, again, then obviously there should be three distinct levels of liability. To which the Gemara says, Ella, Sheba ala amana achas shalosh bios. Rather, we'll say what it must mean is, it's the same amana, same widow, he had relations with her 3 times. So the Gemara says, okay, well, what's the case? Heichi dami. Idolo asrube, if at the end of the day there was no hasra, right? If there's no hasra, so pshita deino chayv al achas. We'll say, in other words, if he only got hasra once, right? Well, let's say again, there was no hasra, so of course there'll only be one liability. In other words, if there's no hasra, technically speaking, there's no liability. What the Gemara is saying is, assuming there's only one hasra, ultimately again, you're only chayiv once. Ela da'asru be'akol chada v'chada. Rather, it must be able to say what? They gave him hasra before every act. If that's the case, Amai eno chayiv ela achos. Shabbos say, why should he only be chayiv once? In other words, if you received hasra before every single act, then halacha l'maisa, you should be chayiv for everyone. V'atanan, we learned, Nazir shayashosi yayin kol hayom kulo. If a Nazir was drinking wine the entire day, eno chayiv ela achos. Ultimately, again, he is only chayiv once. He's only chayiv once. Amrulo al tishta v'ushose chayiv akol achas v'achas. So we'll say if they warn him before each and every act, then he's chayiv for each time. So again, even if it's the same woman that Kohen Gadol is having relations with, but if he receives hasra before every act, why would he not be chayiv for each individual act? To which the Gemara says, Lo tzricha sheba ala manas Ruvain shahaisa manas Shimon shahaisa manas Levi. Interesting, I will say. It's the same woman who was married to 3 different men, right? So we'll call her Rachel. Rachel was married to Ruvain died. Rachel was married to Shimon died. And Rachel was married to Levi died. So she's an almana, interesting, she's an almana from 3 different marriages. So the Gemara says, and now Kohen Gadol has relations with her. So Ma'adatim, what would you have thought? Hari Shemos Michulakim. You might have thought, listen, maybe it should be chayiv 3 times. Why? Why? I will say why. Because she has 3 distinct widow identities, right? right? A widow of Ruvain, a Ruvain of Shimon, a Ruvain of Levi. So I might have thought, therefore, because she has three distinct widow identities, therefore you should be chayiv 3 times. Kamashmala, no. Gufim mechulakim ba'inan v'laka. I will say the only time that a kohen is going to be chayiv for distinct liabilities is one of 2 cases. Either if it's 3 different widows, or if it's 3 different acts and he received hasra for each individual act. But if halacha l'maisa, he has relations with one woman who was widowed 3 times, that's only considered to be one act of illegal relations, and therefore he's only chayiv once. Incredible. Almana, grusha, chalala, zona. So now watch this. What happens? Well, it's the same woman, right? So Rachel is an almana, she's a divorcee, she's a chalala, and she's a zona. Now remember again, how do you get the identity of a zona? Remember again, zona is a specific halachic definition. Zona is a woman who has relations with someone whom she cannot marry, who she can't effect Kiddushin with. So it could be something as dramatic as having relations with her brother, right? Or it could be something like having relations with a non-Jew, right? Where halacha, right? Remember again, because you cannot affect Kiddushin with a non-Jew, so therefore that bia would make her a zona. So the Gemara says, now watch this. So the Gemara says, Hai Tana, my kasara. Now both say, now remember again, there, what the Gemara, now in that case, we'll say, remember again, what the Brisa said was like this. If halacha l'maisa, she acquired the identities in that order. She first became an almana, then a grusha, then a chalala, and then a zona. That's the way it's spelled out in the Torah. Bosai. Remember again, these are all women that a kohen cannot marry. Kohen gadol can't marry, right? So all women that kohen gadol. So again, if she acquires it in that order, then einachinami, one bia will generate all of this liability. If, however, she acquires the identities not in this order, then you'll only be chayiv one. So we'll say that's analyzed. So almana, grusha, chalala, zona. So haitana my kasara. So we'll say. Now, it was fascinating is there's this possibility, according to the Brisa, that halacha l'maisa, for one act of bia, the kohen is going to be chayiv for all of these things, having relations with an almana, in the order, grusha, chalala, zona. So what's the pshat? So haitana ma'kasavar, ikasavar, isser chalal isser. They will say if he holds. Now we've seen these concepts before. I will say isser chalal isser means if something is aser, can another layer of Isser devolve upon it? So that's the machlokes. Isser Chalal Isser, Ein Isser Chalal Isser. So the Gemara says, if he holds Isser Chalal Isser, Ipchanami. So we'll say, if you hold Isser Chalal Isser, that literally again, one prohibition could devolve upon another prohibition, then who cares what order she acquired these identities in? In other words, again, what does it matter? Amana, Grusha, Chalala, Zona, or Zona, Chalala, Grusha, Amana? Who cares? One Isser could devolve upon another, therefore should be chayiv. So the Gemara says, and if you hold that one Isser cannot devolve upon a pre-existing layer of Isser, if that's the case, then again, one Isser can never devolve upon another, in which case the most you could be liable for is what? One of these prohibited identities. Amarava, so what's the case? Amarava, Hai Tana Savar Isser Chalal Isser, I'm sorry, Hai Tana Isser Chal Isser Leslie. Say Nachinami, you're right. Our Tana holds will say that in general, ein Isser Chalal Isser. Once you have an existing level of Isser, another level of Isser cannot go ahead and be superimposed on top of it. But what does he hold? Listen to this. Isser Mosif Islay. That's the name I'll say. So we've seen this before. So it could be that in general a person holds ein Isser Chalal Isser. Now, I'll say, let me go back for a second. If you hold Isser Chalal Isser, which means a new layer of Isser could go ahead and devolve upon a pre-existing layer of Isser. If you hold that, it doesn't really matter what kind of Isser A is, or Isser B is, or Isser C is, they just keep piling up on each other. If you hold ein Isser Chalal Isser, then in general, one Isser could not devolve upon a pre-existing level of Isser. There might be an exception to this rule, which is when the second Isser is what we call an Isser Mosif. Isser Mosif means the second Isser is broader, includes something that the first one does not. So sometimes, even if you hold ein Isser Chal al Isser, but if the second Isser is an Isser Mosif, it adds on something, it's broader than the first, then ein achinami could devolve even upon the first. So the Gemara says, therefore watch this. Almana, Asur the Kohen Gadol, V'shayr the Kohen Hedyot. Now, say, now watch this. So therefore, if you have a woman who's an almana, so remember again, almana is prohibited to a Kohen Gadol, but permitted to a regular Hedyot. Now, both say, now watch this. Havile grusha. So therefore, both say, if this same woman now becomes a grusha. So remember, grusha both say is what? It's an Isser Mosif. Why is it an Isser Mosif? Why is it an Isser Mosif? Because a grusha is not only prohibited to a Kohen Gadol, but also prohibited to a regular Kohen as well. So both say, therefore, you would say, Miga di Tosif le Yisur legabe Kohen Hedyot, Itosif la Yisur legabe Kohen Gadol. We'll say, then we would say the same way that is a broader Isser. Why? Because it applies now to a Kohen Hedyot. So the same way that the Isser expands for a Kohen Hedyot, it'll also expand for a Kohen Gadol. There was interestingly enough, this woman is still permitted to go and eat truma if she is either ultimately again if she doesn't have children, right? So the Gemara says habile chalala. Now we'll say if she becomes a chalala, then we could say miga di tosef isur lemechal b'truma, itosef isur legabe kohen gadol. Now both say now you could say, but if she becomes a chalala can't eat truma. A further expansion of an Isser. So it's saying the same way that the Isser expanded for the Kohen Gadol, it also expands. Elazona, my Isser Moses. So say, see what's happening over here? You see, if you hold Isser Chal al Isser, that one Isser could devolve upon another Isser, then the way in which she gets these identities doesn't make a difference, because one could always devolve upon the other. However, if you hold Ein Isser Chal al Isser, if you hold one Isser does not devolve upon another Isser, then the only way for one Isser to devolve upon another Isser is how? Is if the secondary Isser is what we call an Isser Mosif. It's broader in scope than the previous one. So now the order makes sense. If the woman starts out as an almana is only a problem to a Kohen Gadol. If she then becomes a grusha, so now what happens? Grusha will say expansion. Bless you, right? Expansion. What's the expansion? It now applies to a Kohen Hedyot. Well, once it expands for a Kohen Hedyot, it also expands for a Kohen Gadol. Then, if she becomes a halala, that's a further expansion. Why? Because now as a halala, she can't eat truma. So the Isra has expanded. If it's expanded again for truma, it's also expanded for kohen gadol. The problem is when we get to zona, what's the expansion of zona? El zona my Isra Mosif Islay Isba Amrav Chana Barav Katina Hoel V'Shem Znus Posel Yisrael. All of us listen to this. When a woman becomes a zona, Rabbosai, zona is not only an issue vis-a-vis kahuna, but zona is also an issue vis-a-vis a Yisrael. A Yisrael will say, right? A Yisrael would also have an issue ultimately again marrying a zona. So that makes it an Isra Mosif. Now again, once it's Mosif, once it broadens its reach in Yisrael, it ultimately will devolve upon the Kohen Gadol as well. Incredible. So Tani Tana Kamid Rav Sheshes. Both say first one line. Kol shehu b'yikach, harihu below yikach. Kol she'ena b'yikach, eno below yikach. So Rabbi say, what's the halacha over here? So the Gemara says like this: any time that a person is obligated or is bound by yikach. Rabbi say the yikach that they're referring to over here is hu isha bifsula yikach. Right? Whenever ultimately again is a kohen gadol, whenever a person is obligated to marry a besula, which is only refers to a kohen gadol, he is subject to lo yikach. He's subject to these prohibitions of not taking an almana, a grusha, a halala, and a zona. And whoever ultimately again is not subject to yikach, ultimately against the Gemara, the chol she'eno b'yikach, eno below yikach. Prat lekohen gadol sheba'al achoso. So achoso almana. So what does this come to exclude? This comes to exclude a kohen gadol who has relations with his sister who is an almana. I will say, now what does that mean? So you might have thought that maybe there's liability for the fact that she's an almana. No, because since halacha l'maisa, she was never in the parsha ultimately of being able to become a wife to the kohen gadol because it's his sister. Therefore, she's also now subject to the prohibition of almana. Okay, again, you still have the little issue of arayas, right? But lamaisa, there's not a problem of almana. Amarle, the Amar says, Amarle, the Amarlach money. Whose opinion is this? Rabbi Shimon, the Amar, Ein Isser Chalal Isser. Now, both say this must be the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon holds Ein Isser Chalal Isser, right? Because again, if in other words, what the Gemara is saying over here is that halacha l'maisa, there is no prohibition of almana because she is already prohibited ultimately as his sister. This obviously reflects the view of Rabbi Shimon that one isser cannot devolve upon another isser. This Sanya, Rabbi Shimon says ha'ochel nevela b'yom kippur and pater. The Gemara says fascinating. Rabbi Shimon holds if you eat an avela, remember again what's an avela? The avela is an animal that died without shechita. If you eat an avela on Yom Kippur, Rabbi Shimon says you're pater. The Gemara say why are you pater? Why are you pater? You're not going to be liable for Yom Kippur consumption. Why? Because the item that you ate was already prohibited to you beforehand. Since it was prohibited to you as an nevela, so therefore the prohibition of Yom Kippur does not devolve upon this nevela. Ein iser chal al iser. One prohibition cannot devolve upon a pre-existing condition. Incredible. The Rabbanan, because going to Rabbanan ha'amri, iser chal al iser. The Rabbanan say no, one iser could devolve upon another iser, and therefore if you eat an nevela on Yom Kippur, you'll be chayiv ultimately again for nevela and for consumption on Yom Kippur. To which the Gemara says no. Afilu temer Rabbanan. Could even be the Rabbanan. How so? Ki amri Rabbanan iser halal iser. When did the Rabbanan say that one iser can be halal, another iser? Hani mili iser chamra iser kal. So Rabbi say, here's what's interesting. It seems to be the way this works is like this. Even if you subscribe to the concept of ein iser halal iser, that one level of iser could devolve upon a pre-existing level of iser, everyone agrees the second iser has to have something unique, right? There has to be something more. So, for example, the Rabbanon who hold iser halal iser, when is that so? That's only ultimately, again, hani mili iser chamer. That's only if the second iser is more chamer than the first. Aval iser kal, but Rabbi say if the second iser is the more lenient iser, then ultimately, again, aval iser kal. Aval iser kal al iser chamer lo chayil. It won't work. Ika da'amri, others explain. Da'amri hamani rabbananu. Whose opinion is this? It's Rabbanan da'amri iser chal al iser. Iser chal, v'chi amri rabbanan iser chal al iser, hani mili iser chamar al iser kal. And what's even the Rabbanan? When did the Rabbanan hold the iser chal al iser? That's only ultimately when the second iser is more chamar. So we'll say, see what's happening, or something very interesting. Let's finish. Aval iser kal al iser chamar lo chayil. Ultimately, because we'll say, if you have a secondary lenient iser, that is not going to be chal on a more chamer primary iser. Di Rabbi Shimon, because if it's Rabbi Shimon, iser, the Gemara says hashta iser chamra iser kal lo chayil. According to Rabbi Shimon, about say ein iser chal al iser. So even an iser chamer is not going to be chal on an iser kal. So the Gemara says iser kal iser chamer mi boy. Then certainly an iser kal is not going to devolve upon an iser chamer. So what would you have thought? Ma'al detema. I would have thought maybe iser kahuna sheni. Maybe the kahuna is different, and I will say maybe by kahuna, if you hold iser halal iser, maybe even an iser kal, a more lenient iser, could devolve upon a more chamer iser. Kamashmala, no, it doesn't work that way. So I will say, I just want to point that out very interesting to you. So just to keep this in mind, what we're left with over here is a general machlokas about Isser Halal Isser, right? Can one level of Isser devolve upon a pre-existing layer of prohibition? And this could have so many different ramifications. So there's a machlokas. There's an opinion that says yes, and an opinion that says no. And here's what's interesting. Even in the opinion of Osei that says yes, everyone agrees that second Isser has to bring something additional to the table. Something additional to the table. So whether it's that the secondary isser is more chamer, or maybe the secondary isser is broader, but it's got to bring something else to the table. Now the interesting thing might be that even according to the opinion that says that ein isser halal isser, that opinion might also agree in the case of what? Isser mosif. Right, in a broader isser. Okay, just to keep in mind. Again, we're not coming to a conclusion in this machlokes. We're just kind of plowing through it a little bit. So we'll say, let's go weiter. Interesting case here. Good. Listen to this case. Yisrael habalachoso. A Yisrael has relations with his sister. Right, let's say you know that we've been doing this for a while. When just like the cases of incest are just the straightforward cases, right? So straightforward cases, right? So this is no other complications over here, right? Just Yisrael haba alachoso, right? So Yisrael has relations with his sister. Sazona mashvila, chalala mashvila olo mashvila. So let's say here's what I know. Now let's go back to what we said before. What's the result of that act? So leaving aside the liability, what's the status ramification of that act? So now the sister is a zona. We'll say, remember again, what did we say before? What's the definition of a zona? Anytime a woman has relations with a man with whom she cannot marry, she becomes a halachic zona. That's the technical. We think of zona much more as like a descriptive term of an immoral woman, but that's not halachically. That could be it also, right? But lamaisa in halacha, it's a technical category that refers to a woman who had relations with someone whom she cannot marry. So therefore, again, Reuven has relations with his sister Rachel. Ultimately, again, she is now a zona. What's the shaila? Does he make her into a halala as well? Interesting. Is she chalala? Right? Chalala mashi or lo mashila? So mi arminan kavachor mechavi lavin. So I'm sorry. Mi arminan kavachor mechavi lavin havi chalala mechavi krisis lakoshkin. Now, we can say like this. Remember, how does a woman generally become a chalala? How does it work? I will say. So from a lav, a kohen marries a grusha. That's a lav. So if a relationship punishable by a lav creates a chalala, then I will say all the more so what? All the more so a relationship punishable by kares. Right? Incest punishable by kares should certainly create chalalos. Odama, ein chalala ela me'isr kahuna. Or maybe not, we'll say maybe chalala only comes from kahuna. Right? In other words, we'll say the only way to create a halal is how? If there's a kohen involved. If there's no kohen involved, you can't create halalos. Amarle ein is halala ela me'isr kahuna bilba. So he answered, no, the halacha is that there is no halalos except from kahuna. So that is going to be the rule. Only a kohen could create the halal. Again, no matter how terrible the prohibition is, even an Isser Kares does not create halal. It's incredible. How do I know that? How do I know that halalos only comes from kahuna? That has to be a kohen involved. Where do I get that from? The Sanya, lo yomar grusha bekohen gadol, v'tisi b'kavachomer mekohen hedyot. The Torah did not have to state the prohibition of grusha by kohen gadol, and I would have learned it out from a kavachomer, from a kohen hedyot. Va'anamina, and I would have said, hashta the kohen hedyot, asura the kohen gadol miboy. So we'll say, again, if the Torah, and remember, all the Torah needed to do was to state the prohibition of grusha when it comes to a kohen hedyot, and I would have said that what? If a grusha is asura to a kohen hedyot, then what? She's certainly asura to a kohen gadol. So lama nebra. So we'll say, so why does the Torah go ahead and say, why does the pasuk say the prohibition of a grusha to a kohen gadol as well? Kashem shechaluka grusha mizona bechalala bekohen hedyot. To teach me the same way that ultimately, again, shkein shechaluka grusha mizona bechalala bekohen hedyot. The same I will say that ultimately, again, there are separate prohibitions. Ultimately, again, from a grusha from a grusha zona and chalala by kohen hedyot, kach chaluka by kohen gadol. So too, there are separate prohibitions by a kohen gadol as well. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Kach chaluka. Kashim shechaluka grusha mizona v'chalala. What's that first white line? Hamuros etzel kohen hedyot sheyichid lav liatzma v'isha grusha mi'isha leika chulamdecha shem zona v'chalala grusha hiloka la af mishum grusha. So what's that to teach us that halacha l'maisa, if one woman has all of these identities, ultimately, and the kohen has relations with her, he's chayav for each and every one of the prohibited identities. So too, again, by kohen gadol as well. Kachaluka b'kohen gadol. To which the Gemara says, pshita. Well, says it's obvious. Whatever is going to be true by a kohen hedyot is certainly going to be true by a kohen gadol. So the Gemara says, mikra gara. Would a kohen gadol be any worse than a kohen hedyot? Ela kashem shechaluka grusha mizona v'chalala b'kohen hedyot kach amona chaluka migrusha v'chalala v'zona b'kohen gadol. To it's the same way that these identities are separate and distinct by a kohen hedyot, they're also separate and distinct by kohen gadol. Lama ne'amra. So the Gemara says, "Lama ne'amra in chalala ela mi'isr kahuna." So we'll say, so the Gemara says, so what? So I'm sorry, chalala lama ne'amra. So we'll say, salach lamaisa. What the Gemara is essentially asking is like this. If we already know whatever applies to a kohen hedyot is going to apply to a kohen gadol, so why the need to restate the prohibitions? To which the Gemara says to teach us the following. Chalala lama ne'amra Ein chalala elami isser kuna. So we'll say the restating of each of these things by the Kohen Gadol is there to teach us an important lesson. So what does the restating of Chalala teach me? That Chalala is only the result of a Kohen involved in the relationship. Zona lama Namra. Why does it say Zona? Namra kan Zona v'Namra lahalan Zona. Makan zaro chulin. Afkan zaro chulin. Both say to teach us that the offspring with a Zona, ultimately again, the offspring halacha l'maisa, is going to be chulin. Again, the offspring is not damaged through the relationship. It's chulin, right? It's chulin. In other words, it's chalalos, but it's chulin. In other words, there's no mamzerus. Amar Vashi hilchach koina balachoso tap of ayin ches zona mashvila chalala lo mashvila. Therefore, Rabbi say halacha l'maisa. Going back to our original question, when a kohen has relations with his sister, ultimately, again, he makes her into a zona, but ultimately, again, not a chalala. Chazar uba if he has relations with her again, then asa chalala. Ultimately, I will say, in that case, halacha l'maisa, he would go ahead and make her into a chalala. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, Chazar ba'aleh, hu a kohen acher, asa chalala, she'asula mishum zona, she'enog l'ela b'guna. So we'll say, so now watch this, something very interesting happens. So halacha l'maisa, what the Gemara is suggesting over here is as follows. So let's go back. Let's take a step back for just a second. Right? So now remember, how do we get into this? We got into this by with the question of, if a man has relations with his sister, what's the impact of that prohibited act? So first of all, again, what we see is, he makes her into a zona. What doesn't he make her into? What doesn't he make her into? A chalala. Why not? We'll say that's the whole point is, why not? Because chalalos, good morning, chalalos is only created ultimately, again, through kohanic involvement in a relationship. There's no such thing as chalalos without kohana. So if a Kohen's involved, then ultimately, again, a Kohen could make her into a chalala. A Yisrael by himself, right? Even an Isser Krisos, an Isser Kares, ultimately, again, cannot create a chalala. They will say, what's interesting over here is now the corollary to that case is, if a Kohen has relations with his sister, then I will say, what does he do? He makes her into a zona. Right? Ultimately, again, I will say, so that the logic over there is because, remember, the prohibition of sister is a much more chamer prohibition, and that's why we look at that act of relations ultimately through that lens. So he makes her into a zona, and I will say, banana chalala. Now, again, now that she's a zona, we'll say now if she's a zona, if now a Kohen were to have relations with her, right, either that same Kohen, her brother, or another Kohen, then that second act of relations ultimately would make her into a chalala. Okay, just an interesting idea. So we'll stop over here for today. So again, what do we come out with? Like, whoa, I don't know, right? What do we come out with? So I'll say, so let's go back to the halachas that we learned. So first of all, we learned a couple of, we didn't get to the gerus sugis. The gerus sugis and Meretz Hashem are going to be tomorrow. But what we did get to, Rabosai, are a couple of really very interesting and important halachas. Namely, number one, that chalalos, let's work backwards. Chalalos is only created when you have a Kohen involved in the picture. So again, no matter how severe the illegality of a relationship, it cannot create chalalos if there is no Kohen. So even in a case of incest, halach l'mais, again, the woman will become a zona, but she can't become a chalala. Chalalos requires kohanic involvement. Now what happens with chalalos? Shabbos says, remember again, if you have a Kohen who creates a halal, so chalalos is passed down forever. So therefore, again, if halach l'maisa Ruvain, Kohen, marries Rachel, the Grusha, they have a son, that son is a halal, that halalos gets passed down. Chalal gets passed down. Now, when does chalalos get passed down? When it's the father who's a chalal. Then that keeps getting transmitted. What happens if the mother is a chalala? So if the mother is a chalala, then halacha l'maisa, again, if she marries a regular Yisrael, no, if the mother is a chalala and she marries a chalal, then the chalalos gets passed down. But if halacha l'maisa, the mother is a chalala and she marries a regular Yisrael, then what? Then ultimately, again, it ends. Remember, again, marrying Yisrael, that's the mikvah tara. So again, if both parents are halal, then it gets passed down. Father is a halal, gets passed down. But if mother is a halala, but the father is Yisrael, the halalos stops. Elosai, tremendous. Shkoyach, we'll stop over here for today. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a good day, everyone. Shkoyach, everyone. Thank you, my friend. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We'll say also just a reminder: the placards that we put out for Shabbos for the Shvuyim, for the precious neshamas being held captive, they're still here. So if you haven't taken one yet, please take one. And also just a reminder about the rally today at 12 o'clock p.m. at Penn Station.